So Kevin Garnett was in the news yesterday, and he was talking about, and in this article, he talked about how players 10, 20 years ago would have a hard time playing in today's basketball. And when you read into the article, he goes into, he makes some examples such as, today's players, they have to make that shot 10 times out of 10, 20 times out of 20. All right. And he didn't really elaborate in this in the article, but I feel like another possibility is the strength of social media. Today's athletes have so much influence and they have a large voice because they're on so many different platforms, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, even YouTube. Some of them have their own podcasts. All right. So they have so much influence and say so and control, and plus followers. I think that would be a pro for, players from 10 years ago or 20 years ago. But I think that's something else, he didn't add, but I just went on and added it. And my thing of it is, when I hear people talk like this, and the next thing they talk about, well, who's better, LeBron or Michael Jordan? Or I hear people go, well, if you put LeBron back in that era, will he still be dominant? If you put Michael Jordan in today's era, would he still be dominant? When people make these comparisons, I just sit back and the first thing I say is, you really can't compare eras. You can't compare decades, okay? The economy in 1970 was a lot different than the economy now, okay? Gas was cheaper in the 70s. It's not so today. It's not so now. A lot of large cities were more confined and smaller versus today's modern cities. So the list goes on and on and on. You really can't compare decades or even players. I just don't go that far with it. Okay. Now, I feel like in this article, Kevin Garnett made one or two decent examples, but overall, I still don't believe you can really compare eras. But if he wants to do that, that's fine. Me personally, if you talk about players from the 90s and the 80s, I'm just going to use the 90s and the 80s. I'm not even going to use the 60s and the 70s. That era was so different, where you have to be a well-rounded player, okay, to be in the starting lineup. You have to be above average as a scorer. You have to be above average as a defender. And you have to be above average dependable. And the criticism was hot. I'm not saying the criticism is not hot now, but it was extremely hot then. Plus, the fact that in the 90s and in the 80s, players really didn't dictate franchises. They didn't tell franchises who to get. Now, there were some examples. Yes, the Michael Jordans, the Magic Johnsons, the Larry Birds, the list goes on and on and on. But for the most part, players really didn't get a lot of say-so like they do now, okay? I feel like today's players will have a hard time dealing with coaches, because coaches would run the teams. They would run the franchises. They would determine who starts and who's going to be on the starting lineup. I mean, who's going to be on the bench. They dictate time. They dictate they dictate your credibility. All right. It's not the fact that, you also have, it was like you had to show them on the court, but you also had to show them with the organization. Are you a dependable player? Are you well-rounded? And if you're not well-rounded, you still had a career in the NBA. They just labeled you a specialty player. You're only good at one thing and one thing only. Like Ruben Patterson was labeled a defensive stopper. I remember they used to coin him the Kobe stopper. All right. There was other players that Dale Curry, not him for say, but there was players that came off the bench who just their only use was to score. If you was down by 6 or 8 points, you would just put him in and he would just, light it up, okay? Because he was hot like a microwave. So specialty players had a place in those eras, but it was mainly on the bench. Today's player, if you're a great scorer, you could be on the starting lineup. You may be awful on defense, okay? You may not be very dependable, but you can still be on the starting lineup if you can score, okay? So I think there's a yin and a yang for when you start debating these eras, all right? Another thing today's players can adjust to versus players from the 90s and the 80s is you're plastered everywhere and you get hit from everybody, not only media members, not only stations. Your fans are like a stone throw away from you, okay? If a fan follows you on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, wherever, YouTube, and if you had an awful game, that fan can directly communicate to you, okay? I feel like players back then, not all of them, but I feel like players back then will have a hard time coping with that. The availability that you have with not only the press members, but just your everyday run-of-the-mill fan. And I feel like in the 80s and 90s, you had moments in time where you can just sit back and chill. You can isolate yourself from all the madness for a week or a few days or maybe even a month, okay, when the season is over with. But you don't have that luxury in today's players, all right? Today's players, they're available 24/7, 7 days a week, okay? So I think that's another thing, Kevin Garnett didn't go and elaborate in the article, okay? But I feel like the modern day player, they're more physically, they're more healthier. They're more athletic than players in the 80s and 90s. We had examples of those type of players in the 80s and 90s, but let's just not sit up here and say overall the whole league was athletic, okay? That can jump out of the gym and things of that nature. And I'm not going to sit up here and say even today's players. There's some players that's on the rosters today that may not be hellified athletic or jump straight out the gym, all right? But my thing of it is, Kevin Garnett, to me, I really don't think, now when he goes to the point of, well, yesterday's players will have a hard time playing in this league. Now, I don't like going into this realm, but let's just go ahead and just go into this realm. I feel like players from the 80s and 90s would dominate in this modern NBA because they would have, for one, they would adapt and would be grandfathered in a lot of stuff that today's players are accustomed of having, which is say so. A lot of players back in the 80s and 90s didn't have a say-so, particularly if you were good or even if you were great, all right? I feel like, if you pull players from the past and let them play today, they would have a voice and say-so on how and what type of style that they're going to play. Another thing I feel like yesterday's players could benefit from today's players is you didn't have to go through all that practice. You didn't have to practice in the morning, practice in the afternoon, shoot around before the game. You do your interviews for the media, you rest a night, and then you repeat the same process over and over again. Today's modern play, they don't necessarily have, their practice time is cut in half. They don't have a full training camp like back in the day. Okay, they don't have to they don't have to spend all summer long to perfect their craft. Okay, and that takes a lot of rest off their legs, and they're more fresher and they're more healthier. Okay, plus modern day science, a lot of players from back in the day could benefit from modern day science. A lot of these players, like Larry Bird, if Larry Bird would be playing today, he would be in the league more. He'll have more years in the NBA today than he did, back in the day, because of the modern medical and science, and the technology just wasn't at its apex like it is today. All right. So, yeah, there are a lot of benefits that modern day players are taking advantage of that players from the 80s and 90s can benefit from. Now, as far as today's players, if they can go back into time and play in the 80s and 90s, I feel like the biggest question is, a lot of people say about LeBron James. I don't think LeBron James could make it in the 80s and 90s. And LeBron James, I think he'll be great in the 80s and 90s, but he'll have to understand the stuff that he's accustomed of having now, he would not have a custom of having back in the 80s and 90s. A huge voice on social media. He would have to give up on that, because there was no social media back then. Plus, the way, how the nutrition, the dieting, the fitness, this man spends $1 million a year on his body, and the technology and the modern science wasn't at its apex like it is today. I think LeBron James would have a shorter career, in the NBA, not because of his play. I feel like a lot of the modern science things that he take full advantage of, he would not have that advantage, if he was in the 80s and 90s. I don't think he would be playing 14 or 15 years. Okay, I think he'll be playing 10, maybe 11, 12 years, but I think that'll be pretty much it. You'll see a progression of him from as a rookie all the way through the fourth year, and then you'll see him in his prime, and then when he's out of his prime, you're going to see 3 years of his out of his prime. He's not going to be that same player like he once was. Okay, so it's a yin and a yang effect. And I really don't like comparing eras or comparing players, because there's a lot of stuff behind all that stuff that you have to take in full advantage. And to me, not to say that he couldn't play in that era. He could play in that era, but things were different back then. Okay. It wasn't a big deal to get a triple double. Not to say it's a big deal to get a triple double now, but back then teams would have a tendency to divvy out their responsibilities and duties to everybody on the basketball team. It wouldn't just be one person dominating in assists, dominating in rebounds, dominating in scoring. It would be a team effect. Okay. That's why, I feel like a lot of people, I feel like if Michael Jordan could take advantage of modern day science and modern day tech, he would improve his assists. He would improve his rebounds, because he will have plenty of energy to still do the scoring. All right. So there's a lot of things a lot of people don't take in advantage when they start comparing these eras. Me personally, I just don't think you can do it. I don't think you can truly justify it. And there's a lot of stuff in these basketball eras that a lot of people are not taking accountable for, just like the 80s and 90s. The rigors and the struggles that players had to deal with in the 80s and 90s, today's players will have to deal with that. Just like players from the 80s and 90s will have to deal with the same problems and the rigors of modern day players today. Okay, so There's a lot of, and I feel like the coaching thing, where coaches have a bigger voice for the franchise than the player, I feel like that will rub a lot of players the wrong way. I don't think players, I feel like the majority of them would just keep it pushing, keep it moving. That's why there haven't been a lot of coaches like old school coaches like that. The coach in the NBA that's today that still have those old school tactics is Greg Popovich. All right. And it's just one of those things. I just don't. It's hard to sit up here and to say, oh well, Michael would have he won 6 titles back then. He probably would have won 12 titles in today's league. Okay, just like LeBron James, would he still be successful now if he was back in the 80s and 90s? Because philosophies change. Okay, coaches' philosophy would dictate to LeBron. I don't think LeBron James would be in the record book if he was back then, not because of modern medicine and fitness and things of that nature, but plus coaches had a huge say so on things. All right, so I just don't see him having that type of impact in the record book. Okay, trying to own all the records. Okay, so yeah, that's all I gotta say, guys. Tell me what you think. I will talk to you guys later on. Deuces.